So in 1992, Art Silverman was working at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. At that time, Art was involved in research that was trying to communicate the health challenges involved in popcorn. So they actually went to 12 local theaters, they collected a number of popcorn samples, they sent them to a lab, the lab analyzed those samples of popcorn, and Art and his team were able to learn that a medium packet of popcorn contains 37 grams of saturated fat, and the Center for Disease Control in the United States recommended only 20 grams. So in some sense, they had a finding that told them that this bucket of popcorn was not very healthy, but they needed to communicate that to a world that was not interested in popcorn, that was not interested in how healthy popcorn could be. So they needed to find a way to catch people's attention. And Art is a very skilled communicator, so what he decided to do is to try to encapsulate as much as he could, not in facts, not in statistics, but in a story. So his one-liner, his summary of the report was that a medium-sized buttered popcorn contains more artery-clogging fat than a bacon and eggs breakfast, a Big Mac and fries for lunch, and a steak and dinner with all the trimmings. Okay? And our strategy was successful. For one day in the 90s, United States talk about popcorn, talk about how unhealthy popcorn was, and this appeared in CBS, in NBC, in USA Today, was covered by the Los Angeles Times and so forth. So Art was able to take something that might seem dry and unappealing, statistics about the health risks of popcorn, and transform them into something interesting that was able to catch the attention of people. And he was able to do that because he didn't communicate statistics, he was able to communicate a story, something that really made a mental picture. When you read the communication that he produced, you imagine those things. You imagine the bacon and eggs, the breakfast, the Big Mac. He painted a picture in your head that allowed you to compare popcorn not in numerical terms, but in much more concrete, tangible terms to other things that you might be familiar with. So it is important to communicate in terms of stories, and that is not something decorative or simply aesthetic. Stories do matter, but we need to understand why stories matter, and then I'm going to try to tell you how to write a story or how to structure a story. So first, I want to try to convince you that stories matter, that stories are not just an entertaining way of saying things. So I'm going to make a few points, and I'm going to try to do this in a way that is a little bit interactive. So why do stories matter? So let's try an exercise. Imagine that I have these little 4 lines in the screen, and each one of them represents a letter, and I want to have you guys guess, the word that I'm thinking about, So for example, I can say, Ole, tell me a letter. What letter do you think is there? A. There's no A. Philippe. E. There is an E. Lea.
C.
There's no C. Krista. B. There's no B. So it is a bit of a boring game. I was trying to get you guys to play fire. But if I take the same idea that we have a series of unknown letters and we're trying to guess a word, and instead of putting them in this context, I use this, all of a sudden, I baked in a little story that makes this much more engaging and much more memorable. This is the game of the hangman. I don't know, how do you call this in Hungarian? Hangman? Okay. And you've all played hangman, so in some sense tells you that the same activity, by adding a story to it, is going to become more engaging, it's going to become more memorable, it's going to be more sticky, more easy to communicate. Nobody around the world talks about the game in which you guess letters to try to guess a word. People talk about hangman, which is a game that, for example, my 9-year-old daughter enjoys, very much. So let me give you another example of why, stories matter. So here you see a sequence of words, and I'm going to ask you to look at this, sequence of letters, and to try to remember as many letters as you can. So you're going to look at these letters, and then if I hide them, I can ask, Leah, how many letters do you remember from that list?
Maybe 4 or
Okay? Which letters you remember?
R, Y, I, A, E.
Okay? It gets hard, no? There's a lot of letters. So let me do something now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the location of the spaces. So there's going to be the same letters in the same order, but they're going to be spaced differently. How much easier is to remember? You know, and now it's much easier to remember because basically each one of these letters are not floating, you know, there by themselves, but they're part of a concept, you know, so you can remember CIA, FBI, NASA, you know, there you remember already, you know, 10 letters without having to remember each one of them. You not only remember the letters, you remember the order in which the letters appear. So that's something that stories can do. Remembering things is very hard, but stories allow you to connect things in such a way that you can remember many things without the need to remember the elements. It's not an exercise on raw memorization. Stories are theories, are mechanisms. You know, they tell us how things relate to one another, and we're much better at remembering how things relate to one another and how, you know, these mechanisms evolve or how these stories play out than we're remembering things. You know now from this example that this is the case, so let me give you another example. I'm going to give you 7 objects. And I have you remember those 7 objects. There is a plane, there's some pumpkins, croissant, a stethoscope, a leaf blower, a flower, and a helmet. And I'm going to ask you to remember those objects. You know, how many of you can remember the 7 objects? It's hard. Maybe you can remember. How many you remember, Balash?
I think 5. Like helmet, flower, aeroplane. Was it
Yeah, yeah.
So that's 3. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Now let me see if I give you another 7 objects. You know? So now if I give you these 7 objects, they're going to be much more easy to memorize, you know? Because you know that they're all connected to a story. You not only memorize the objects, you know, if you know this story, The Little Red Riding Hood, I assume this story is also famous in Hungary, you not only remember the elements of the story, you remember how they are connected. You remember that, you know, the wolf in some sense appears, you know, let's say at the end of the first act of the story, you know, and the grandma, you know, appears at the end when the Little Red Riding Hood gets, you know, to the house, you know, sorry, when the lumberjack rescues her from inside, you know, the wolf at the end of the story. So by putting things in the context of a story, you can actually, you know, remember many more things. So if we want to communicate things to other people, we don't want to communicate a sequence of facts, you know, or a set of ideas. We have to weave them into a narrative, and that's a second reason why stories are so powerful. There is a third reason, and this one is subtle, but is also very important. Stories tend to have morals. They tend to have lessons. There's a lesson to a story. There's a point, you know, to a story. Children love to hear stories because they learn something from those stories, from the actions that the characters did, the decisions that they made. But the morals don't necessarily imply a story. You know, it's very hard to reverse, you know, from the moral to a story. So a story implies a moral, but the moral not necessarily implies a story because the morals tend to be more abstract and they make sense in the light of a story. And this is something that actually is very important in the context of generating corporate culture. Many companies are built on stories that are used to communicate to their employees what are the things that they should strive for, what it is to be a good employee in that world. So I'm going to give you an example for Nordstrom. Nordstrom is a luxury department store in the United States, and they are able to charge high prices because they provide very good customer service. So the moral, or like a summary of that in abstract terms, would be Nordstrom is a department store known for outstanding customer service. But what does that mean? What is outstanding customer service? You know? Well, the way that Nordstrom communicates that, you know, to their employees is by telling stories of Nordies. Nordies are employees that work at Nordstrom. So they would tell the story, for example, of the Nordie who ironed a new shirt for a customer that needed it that afternoon. Or the Nordie who gift wrapped products that a customer had bought at another store at Macy's. And by telling you that, they're telling you, look, it's not just about, you know, smiling and being nice to the customer. These are Nordies that are going beyond that. They're giving you examples of what this customer service orientation means that are hard to communicate in the abstract narrative. You know? So the stories are able to go beyond the morals that you can communicate with an abstract narrative, and that's also a reason why stories are important. So stories are important because they help us engage with people. They make things more sticky, memorable, easier to communicate. They help us create, content that is more memorable, more easy to remember. We can remember many more things, when we bake those into a story. And they also help us communicate lessons in ways that are much more powerful than abstract descriptions of those ideas. So now we want to write stories. Hopefully I convince you that stories are a good way to communicate things, but writing is difficult. How many of you have a struggle with writing at some point of your lives? Yeah, we all struggle with writing, and that will never stop. But we all struggle with writing. Writing is difficult, and the reason why writing is difficult is because the world is complicated. Life, stories, ideas, they branch out like a tree. When you're thinking about something, you sometimes think of several different options, and this event could lead to that, or could lead to this other person to think about you in a different way. And what should you talk about first? Like the stories, in their natural environment, they branch out like trees. They're complicated like networks. And language is the opposite of that. Language is like a train. Words have to come before or after another word. Paragraphs have to come before or after another word. So the problem of writing is the problem of transforming that tree into a train. You need to linearize, that complex mesh of ideas. So how can we transform, this tree into a train? And I'm going to try to teach you two techniques that I use, the three writers and the flower. So the three writers is the idea that when you write, you have a set of different voices that you're going to use that are fulfilling different purposes. So every writer needs to learn how to use these three voices. And once you learn these three voices, you're going to learn to recognize those voices also in the text that you read. So the first voice, probably the most obvious, is the storyteller. This is the voice that tells you something that maybe happened to someone else or that happened to yourself. It's kind of like telling a story, telling like a sequence, of events, that took place, and that involve a certain group of people. The second voice is the signposter, and that's a voice, that doesn't speak a lot, but it's really important because it's the one that is going to be able to move a person from one branch to another branch from the tree. It's the one that is going to provide order to the story. What happens with a lot of young, inexperienced writers is that they tend to write a little bit like a sausage. They say one thing, they say another thing, they say another thing, they say another thing, but they're never telling you where is this train going. And there's someone that has to be doing that job. And it's a very different job than the one of the storyteller, because the storyteller is telling a story, is a little bit detached, Anybody could be a storyteller. But when you get to the signposter, it's not a storyteller anymore. It's now the writer taking a much more personal tone and communicating to the reader explicitly about, how the rest of the story is going to be structured, how it is organized. And there is a third voice, which is the interpreter. You have the storyteller that tells stories. You have the signposter that helps you connect these different stories, helps you orient yourself in the document. And you have the interpreter, which is the one that at some point has to make that lesson explicit. At some point, if the three little piggies built, each one of them a home, and the ones that were built out of hay didn't last too long, the interpreter is the one that, in some sense tells you that it's important to work hard and not cut corners. Yeah? So let me give you an example, and you cannot see this because of the Microsoft Teams banner, but of course you have to consider that this is a model. It's a very simple model. We're going to grab any piece of text and we're going to divide it into like three types of voices. And as every model, every model is wrong, but some of them are useful. I find this model to be useful. So I'm going to bring an example from The Righteous Mind. This is an excellent book by Jonathan Haidt, very influential book, in the context of moral psychology. And I'm going to read from the introduction, and then we're going to identify these different voices. Okay? So the introduction goes like this. Can we all get along? That appeal was made famous on May 1st, 1992 by Rodney King, a black man who had been beaten nearly to death by 4 Los Angeles police officers a year earlier. The entire nation had seen a videotape of the beating. So when a jury failed to convict the officers, their acquittal triggered widespread outrage and 6 days of rioting in Los Angeles. 53 people were killed and more than 7,000 buildings were torched. Much of the mayhem was carried live. News cameras tracked the action from helicopters circling overhead. After a particular horrific act of violence against a white truck driver, King was moved to make his appeal for peace. King's appeal is now so overused that it has become cultural quiche, a catchphrase more often said for laughs than as a serious plea for mutual understanding. I therefore hesitated to use King's words as the opening line of this book, but I decided to go ahead for two reasons. The first is because most Americans nowadays are asking King's questions not about race relations, but about political relations and the collapse of cooperation across party lines. Many Americans feel as though the nightly news from Washington is being sent to us from helicopters circling over the city, delivering dispatches from the war zone. The second reason I decided to open this book with an overused phrase is because King followed up with something lovely, something rarely quoted, as he stumbled through his television interview, fighting back tears and often repeating. So that's the first page of the book. You probably want to read more. It's an engaging read, you know. But if we try to break it down, what does Hyde do here? He starts with the storyteller. You know, this is a story from Rodney King. You know, in some sense, he could be telling it, everybody could be telling it. It's a story, you know, about something that happened in Los Angeles, you know, that he can use to motivate, you know, the book. And this is not a book about race. It's not a book about police violence. You know, it's a story that in some sense has, you know, a relationship to what he's going to talk about, you know, which is more about political division in, you know, in the phrase of Rodney King, which is, can we all get along? And then from the storyteller, he goes into the next paragraph as an interpreter. King's appeal is now overused, so overused that it has become a cultural kitsch, a catchphrase more often said for laughs than a serious plea for mutual understanding. So that's not a story anymore. That's someone interpreting the story in the context of what the person, you know, was trying to communicate. And then, you know, he signposts to help you orient you as a reader on what he's going to say next. So I therefore hesitated to use King's words at the opening line of this book, but I decided to go ahead for two reasons. You know? So he doesn't just say one reason and say another reason. He says, I want to say it for two reasons. The first one is, and then that signposter comes back at the beginning of the next paragraph by saying, the second reason I decided to open this book with an overused phrase is because, you know, it doesn't even finish the sentence. It's using the beginning of the sentence. But it's helping you orient yourself, and it's a very different voice from the storyteller because it's not a detached person telling you a story. It's someone that is using a first-person type of language. The second reason I decided, you know, he's talking to you as himself, the writer. You know? So these three voices are really useful, and you need to learn how to use them because otherwise, you know, people maybe stay on only one of them. There's people that stay only on the interpreter, and the interpreter, you know, can be an important and powerful voice, but the problem with the interpreter is that the interpreter tends to be a little bit too abstract. You know, the interpreter is kind of like telling you what the lesson is, but the lesson without the story, you know, as we learned before from the Nordstrom example, is not that great. You know, the signposter might not talk too much, but without that voice, you're going to get lost in the text. Your reader is not going to know where this is going. And that's a very important technique. I find that you want to identify those three voices. You want to learn how to use those three voices. You know? And that's going to help you craft a better story. So every writer needs to learn how to use the three voices and think about, you know, your text. You know, who is saying what? Is it the storyteller? Is it the signposter? Is it the interpreter? You know? And if one of them is missing, you know, you might want to bring him or her into your story. The next technique I want to share with you is one that I call the flower. You know? And this is something also that I learned by writing long-form text. Okay, so when you write an opinion piece of 600 words, you don't have that much of a structure problem because in some sense you are using 5 or 6 paragraphs to express your idea. You know, the intention or where you're trying to go with your idea might be even communicated in the first sentence. But when you're doing longer form text, when you're doing a book, you need to write, you know, 12, 15 chapters in a way in which they all connect, you know? Like that's why those sometimes, in academia we love to have those books that every writer writes a separate chapter, and those books are not meant to be read from the beginning to the end because they lack that spinal cord, that connection. So how do you create that connection? How do you do that? How do you transform the tree into a train, into a train of words in such a way that you preserve that structure? So as I was saying before, like inexperienced writers usually do this. They tell you one thing, then they tell you another thing, then they tell you another thing, furthermore another thing, moreover another thing. And you end up kind of like with text in which you are disoriented, you don't know where it's going, you don't know how things connect. So good writing needs structure, and this is a technique to help you develop that structure. So the first thing that you have to do is you need to identify what is your core idea, what's the core message that you want to communicate. And what you're going to do is you're going to start your book by communicating that core idea. Even the title of your book could be that core idea. And then you're going to go around and you're going to tell that core idea in a way that is relatively short, but with enough detail that you point to the different element of the ideas that you're going to explore later. And then after you went around and you basically told your whole book in 2 pages or your whole book in maybe a page and a half in a relatively short form, as you start exploring these ideas more deeply, you're going to go into the details. But once you go into a detailed idea, you're not going to go from one idea to the next. After you finish telling that idea, you're going to go back to the core. You're going to communicate how that idea connects to the core idea. Basically, you're going to go around the center one more time, and then you're going to go out to the next idea. So what you're doing is you're weaving this type of flower. Yes? You have a core idea, you go around it, then you go into a detailed idea. You don't jump to the next idea because that's the amateur way of doing it. You go back to the core, you connect it, and that doesn't need to be a lot of text. It can be like relatively short. And then from there, you go out again. So you're going in and out from your core idea all the time. And that's going to give you a structure in which that core idea becomes, the spinal cord of your text, And then you weave something that looks, not a very pretty flower, but it resembles, topologically, something like a flower. So let me give you some examples. So I'm going to borrow an example from myself, one of my more recent books, How Humans Judge Machines. And the core idea is that question, how is it that people, how do people judge machines? Yeah? So that's the core idea, how humans judge machines. And then the book is built in such a way that I'm going to go in and out of that idea for each one of the chapters. So the first chapter explores how do people judge? What are the basic concepts in moral philosophy and psychology that I need to know? And how do these help us, understand, human judgment of humans and machines? And then you see I went back to the core idea, and then I'm going to say, okay, now we want to learn more about how people judge machines. We need to learn about how to run experiments to understand, people's judgment of machines and humans. And that chapter goes into, all of the technique of how to run the experiments, how to collect the data, how to analyze it, and so forth, and goes back into the core idea. And then the next chapter does the same and says, well, one aspect that is important, is fairness, so we can explore now using the concepts from the first chapter, the techniques of the second chapter, how is it that people judge machines and humans in the context of fairness. And then we're going to go back to our core idea. We're going to basically bring the interpreter at the end of that chapter, connect it, to the core argument. And then we're going to do the same with privacy. We're going to do the same, with automation. Then we're going to look at patterns across the scenarios. And at the end, we're going to have a more interpreter-heavy and storytelling-heavy chapter in which we're trying to draw the lessons from the previous chapters that we covered. And that's how kind of like you build that structure. Now that structure is useful also for shorter forms of writing. Like in papers, usually when you want to make a transition from one point to the next, try to go to that core idea, try to go to the basic questions, summarize what you just learned, go to the basic question, from the basic question open another secondary question, and move from there. So that's how you weave a flower. So what I'm going to do to conclude is I'm going to try to tell you some writing tips. Okay? So these are going to be things that are, let's say, a little bit more minutiae, more detailed. The other two concepts that I taught you are more structural, yes? They're about developing the structure of your text. But these are tips to help you improve certain parts of the text. And one part of the text that is really important, even though it's very short, are opening sentences. Okay? Opening sentences are not the same as any other sentence in the text. You can make a mistake on page 65 with a sentence that is not that great. That's okay. But the first sentence, it's something special. So let's look at some good first sentences, opening sentences. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Do you know which book is this? Which book starts with it was the best of times, it was the worst of times? This is Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. So in some sense, that opening sentence is a great opening sentence because it's not telling you it was a city that it was divided and it was unequal. No, it's painting you a picture in which, in some sense, it's showing this contradiction. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. So there's this place in which this, contrasted things are happening in parallel. So it's a much more elegant and engaging way of telling you, I'm starting a book about, let's say, inequality in the city and, social relationships in the context of those divisions and inequality. Yeah? This is another famous opening line. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Yeah? Which book is this? You're close. Starts with A. Anna Karenina. Yes, this is from Anna Karenina. So, this is a book in which there's a lot of conflict, between characters, some of them which cheat on one another and they're looking for relationships and so forth. So it's telling you, like, I'm going to tell you a book and my wife is not going to like that I say this, but it's a little bit like a soap opera, that there's a lot of different, like complexities going on between, a long book with many characters and complex relationships across them, many of which involve, like some search for love or lust and whatnot, and like what this book is telling you is like, look, happy families are all alike, so in some sense perfection is not only symmetric, but also it's saying something, it's a little bit like boring, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way because there are many ways in which things can go wrong, So unhappiness, is much more diverse in some sense. Now, this is another opening sentence that I think is great. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know that sentence, no? Where is it from? Not the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence. And what I like about this sentence is that, in some sense, finishes with something that is poetic enough, to inspire. If it would be that there are certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the right to wear weapons, that would not be that great. No, life, liberty, and prosperity, it would be lame too. And the pursuit of happiness, provides kind of like an open-endedness to the sentence that, invites you to read more, because the pursuit of happiness is not something that you can define narrowly, but it's something that you can always aspire to, and that you cannot deny, and that goes beyond things that are as concrete as the life or even liberty, which is complex. It doesn't have the open-endedness of this idea of the pursuit of happiness. So open-end sentences are hard because they have to lift an enormous amount of weight. They must be direct and clear enough to introduce the topic. You cannot change the first sentence from Anna Karenina to the first sentence from The Tale of Two Cities. They're telling you what the book is going to be about. They're doing it elegantly, but they have to be direct and clear enough to make sure that, the book is going to be about a certain, topic. They have to be poetic enough to inspire. Like readers, read until they don't read. And how far you can get them to go along, depends on your ability to keep them entertained, inspired, and engaged. They have to be insightful enough to hook the reader. Usually they have kind of like a little bit of wit, and they have to be fluid enough to transition into the narrative. So a common mistake in academic writing, there's a lot of papers that start with this opening sentence. In recent years, there has been great interest in the study of X. In recent years, there has been great interest in the study of cities. In recent years, there has been great interest in the study of infectious diseases. And trust me, you can get published with that sentence because a lot of people got published with that sentence, and people are going to read through it. But it's not great writing. In some sense, the fact that I can change X for anything, it tells me that all of the lifting is being done by that X. That's the only thing that is telling me what this is about, because everything else is generic. Yeah? So let's look at other, like first sentence. So this is from The Blank Slate, from Steven Pinker. Not another book on nature and nurture. Are there really people out there who still believe that the mind is a blank slate? Isn't it obvious to anyone with more than one child, to anyone who has been in a heterosexual relationship, or to anyone who has noticed that children learn language, but house pets don't, that people are born with certain talents and temperaments? Haven't we all moved beyond the simplistic dichotomy between heredity and environment and realized that all behavior comes out of an interaction between the two? So of course this could have started. In recent years, there has been a great interest in the study of heredity and behavior. Yeah? But isn't it more engaging to say, not another book on it, like it starts kind of like with interpreter making kind of like this complaint about how his colleagues are perceiving him. So this is the reaction I got from colleagues when I explained my plans for this book. And then like he brings in the signed poster to start telling that story. Here's another example of a great sentence. I had the pleasure to write a paper with Steven Pinker a few years ago. It's a paper on language. And we're going to say like there has been great interest in the study of languages. But what he suggested, and what was funny about this is that he suggested this sentence relatively early on, and we edited the paper like 40 times after that, and the first sentence didn't change. And it was, of the thousands of languages that have ever been spoken, only a handful have become influential enough to be considered global languages. So it's a nicer way to tell you this paper is about global languages and their influence. Yeah? It's not a very obvious construction. Of the thousands of languages, to start with an of is already a little bit strange. We're not starting with a the. So there are a few techniques to do first sentences. Sometimes, and this is very common, you want to do like a short hook. You saw that in the case of Steven Pinker. Not another book on nature and nurture. That's a short, to the point, sentence that's called a hook in US parlance. Can we all get along? That's what Jonathan Haidt did. And we do that sometimes as well. Here in a more technical context, not in a context of a book, but in the context of a paper, economies grow by upgrading the products they produce and export. That's the first sentence of our paper on the product space. So it starts with a statement and with a very short, condensed version of the statement that we're going to go then, try to prove. Economies grow by upgrading the products they produce and export. That's kind of like our statement. And then, the introduction, not the abstract, that's the type of products that a country exports matter for subsequent economic performance. It's also a relatively short, sentence. Another way to have first sentences, and this I would say is less done for academic writing, and it's challenging to do, but it works well for long form, magazine articles or sometimes in books, is to have a longer sentence that brings the reader into the middle of a story. So you throw the reader right into some action, and you do that by having a long sentence that starts describing what's happening. Jill Lepore from Harvard University, she writes also for The New Yorker, and she's very good at doing this type of things. One unlikely day, during the empty belly years of the Great Depression, an advertisement appeared in the smeared smash and font of the New York Times classifieds. Wanted, 500 college graduates mailed to perform secretarial work of a pleasing nature. Salary adequate to their position, 5-year contract. Thousands of desperate out-of-work bachelors of arts applied, 500 were hired. So you see, it throws you into the action of a story, by having a 4-line sentence to start with. It's not a short hook. It's kind of like, and there's some books that I'm sure you've read that really start with like sometimes very long sentences, but those long sentences usually, are written by a storyteller that is trying to throw you into the middle of a description. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you is that when you write, you're going to have to make connections between different parts of the text. And just like in the previous case, there's a naive way of doing this, which you want to avoid. So like the naive writer, is going to say things like this. As I said earlier, as previously shown, as chapter 1 showed, So when I say, as I said earlier, I said a lot of things earlier. What am I talking about? Which of all of the things that I said earlier am I talking about? As previously shown, what of all of the stuff that is shown? So when you write and you connect things in text, it's very important that as you write, you are able to develop a language in which you can refer to the things that you already say in a relatively shorthand form. So let me give you an example. As I said earlier, stories carry morals that are hard to communicate in abstract terms. As the Nordstrom's example showed, stories carry morals that are hard to communicate in abstract terms. I don't need a lot more text to do that. Yeah? But in the first one, it was unclear to what I was referring to. In the second one, it's clear to exactly which part of the presentation I am connecting to. And that's something that, if you ever write a book and you get edited, that's one of the things that professional editors are going to pick up on. It's like, no, what? So you avoid the use of pointers like they, or as I said, or as mentioned before, or the latter, the former. All of those are, I think we use them because we're lazy and it's much easier for us not to think of the right word, but to refer to something that in our mind makes sense, but it's not going to make sense on the mind of the reader. So avoid all of this as the former, as the latter, as I previously shown, as demonstrated in chapter 1. Try to say exactly what you mean, and you're going to have a text that is going to connect much more strongly, and you don't need much. Sometimes it's just one word to fire that one synapse of what happened 20 minutes ago or what the person read yesterday. It's going to be enough to bring them back in. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is about writing and rewriting, okay? Because we all know that there is writing, but there's a lot of rewriting, Nobody is good enough that can write something great on a first try, or sometimes, some people can get lucky, but like writing is hard, So when you write, don't worry about rewriting. You let it flow. You try to produce a rough draft with more or less and that's incorrect, is the right structure. The right structure. Perfect. Okay. Now, you see I had to rewrite, Yeah. Rewriting, it's about more than just fixing the language. You're going to fix the language, you're going to fix sentences, you're going to do the connections, but it's about honing the structure to direct the readers towards the end and to clarify its purpose. Because there is one thing that is really important, that the difference between the writer, you, and the reader is that the writer knows how the story ends. The reader doesn't know how the story ends. That's why they're reading. But the writer knows how the story ends, and the writer needs to write knowing that they know how the story ends. So this is something that is communicated by this concept, Chekhov's gun. I don't know if you've heard of Chekhov's gun. So this is a narrative idea, and it's the idea that every element in a story must be necessary. Irrelevant elements should be removed, and if a writer features a gun early in a story, it should be fired later in the story. There has to be a reason, for showing things. That is that you have to use them later. But also by communicating this as Chekhov's gun, hopefully you're going to remember it better. It's a little bit of a story, that helps communicate that idea. So writing has layers, and when you rewrite, you have to pay attention to those layers, because when readers read, they're doing a number of different operations. There is, on the one hand, they're trying to read the text, to extract that literal meaning. What is it that the text says? But on the other hand, they're trying to understand the purpose. Why is the author trying to tell me this? What's the point of this? And that goes a little bit into this Chekhov's gun, why did he show me the gun? What is going to happen with the gun? So I'm going to use as an example the beginning of Animal Farm. I don't know if you guys have read Animal Farm. To me, it's much better than 1984. It's the best book from Orwell. It's not as famous right now as 1984, but I think it's as relevant as 1984. And chapter 1 starts, with a little bit of a story. Mr. Jones of the manor farm had locked the 10 hen houses for the night, but was too drunk to remember to shut the pop holes. With the ring of light from his lantern dancing from side to side, he lurched across the yard, kicking off his boots at the back door, drew himself a last glass of beer from the barrel in the scullery, and made his way up to bed, where Mrs. Jones was already snoring. Okay? So there is a literal meaning. It's, a small, let's say, vignette of a farmer, closing up shop at night, and he's drunk, and he's not doing a very good job. But if you understand what, Animal Farm is about, why is he telling you that? Why is Orwell starting with this picture? What is he trying to tell you about what is going to happen to this farmer, or what's going to happen in the story? That you might not know at that moment. At the moment, it's just a drunk farmer, but you know later as the story progresses. Like, how many of you have read Animal Farm here? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So what happens in Animal Farm? The animals take the farm. Yes, they start a revolution at some point. Not very late in the game. Actually, relatively early in the book, the animals start a revolution. And why do the animals revolt? Were they happy with the farmer? They were not happy with the farmer. They consider the farmer not to be, a great manager or leader. So basically, what Orwell is telling you here is like, there was this lazy farmer that was not doing a very good job. He was drunk. He was irresponsible. So there is a purpose that goes beyond, the literal text. It's setting up a certain aspect of the character that is going to be useful for the development of the plot. So when you rewrite, you have to think about that your reader is not going to just be trying to read what you wrote, but it's also going to be doing that operation. Why is, the writer trying to tell me this? What is he trying to convince me about? What is he selling me? Like all of those type of questions. And they go kind of automatically inside a person's head. And when you rewrite, please keep that in mind. Because writing is hard. It is, very difficult, and you're going to struggle with it all your life. But the truth is that there's only one thing that you can do. Writing is hard, and inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work. Thank you.